So, hi, I'm Monica. I'm looking forward to thinking together about deep time and preferable futures for university librarianship. I'm going to start with defining some terms and telling two stories from recent library history. At the end, I'm hoping we'll have time to reflect alone or together as an option, with many options to engage in the way that works for you. All my slides will be shared after, and my personal email address is included on the last slide if you have anything you'd like me to share or clarify later. So my talk is inspired by the Long Now Foundation's 10,000 year clock. I'm not sure, is the Long Now Foundation well known in the UK? They're very niche. So they are a San Francisco nonprofit. Their entire raison d'etre is to stretch our imagination to the civilization scale of time. And one of their projects is literally a clock built into a mountain that's designed to keep time perfectly for the next 10,000 years. And one of their simplest practices, they place a 0 in front of the current year, which is a small prompt to keep the long view in mind. And that's sort of the spirit that I wanted to bring to this talk today. So I'm going to be throwing around two concepts today, radical sustainability and a few different models of obsolescence. And I want to describe what I mean by them right away. Usually when we talk about sustainability, and this is whether it's kind of the major UN sustainability goals or daily work for those people who work with and in sustainability, we're usually talking about fairness and equity, longer horizons, well-being and thriving for people on the planet, and interdependence. What I do affects you, what you do affects me. In practice, this usually means building, developing, doing whatever we're doing to find a sweet spot between what we need today, where we are, and what the rest of the world, present and future, needs. So you can crank that up a notch and go in any number of directions. But one way that I think about kind of pushing this to a radical level of sustainability is to ask, how do we make what we truly value last for as long as humanly and planetly possible? To me, this means zooming in on our absolute top priorities and designing everything, tools, systems, and habits. So those values can stretch across decades, maybe centuries, maybe millennia. And when I say values, I am absolutely talking about what matters to your institution, as Rachel's discussed, but also to the profession, which has its own set of values, and to you personally. That's really, really important. So the catch is, if we think in the very long term, we need to remember that all this stuff that carries our current values, gadgets, institutions, ideologies, mental models, metaphors we use, all of that will eventually fall away and be replaced by something else. Sometimes it's gradual, and sometimes it's very sharp and fast. And there are different kinds of obsolescence, technical, cultural, environmental. I want to talk about two today that I think are very relevant for our profession right now. So to me, radical sustainability for our work in libraries says design with an expiry in mind. Build things so our core values are ready to hop to the next platform, whatever that is, ideally whatever we dream it to be, which we will talk about. Ultimately, what we want to avoid are certain types of obsolescence that I will get into soon, which have as much to do with power and agency as with tech stacks. And I will be using the word design because it's how I like to think about all of the decision-making processes that we bring when we have a strong vision of the future in mind. So, as Rachel said, I read a lot of technology history, so you will have to put up with a couple of stories. And I was wondering, does anyone know what this is? Has anyone worked with one? Does anyone have one in their library? Any idea what the medium is? It's microfilm. It's funky microfilm. So I'm obsessed with this object. So this is computer output microfiche. So this would have been printed from a computer directly onto microfilm for the purpose of distributing information to universities that couldn't afford a computer terminal, but which had a microfiche reader. And at one point, this looked like the future. There were lots of grants for this. There was lots of shiny conversation about this. There were lots of leadership in libraries being really excited about these things. And of course, right now, right away, I'm hoping you're thinking, what does the future look like right now that's very shiny and exciting that we're going to look back on as being painfully useless? So it always helps me to start with history when asking big abstract questions. And today, I'd like to look at some library history for recent lessons we can learn as we kind of work with these big ideas in opening the day together. And it might seem pretty unambitious to start talking about the long future in deep time by discussing microfilm. But I would argue, first of all, the technology represents a huge piece, not just of our collective library imagination, but our collective cultural imagination around obsolescence, because for as long as we've had mass print, we have fantasized about making it smaller and shrinking it so we can store more of it. And then we have to figure out how to blow it back up again. And the future vision for books has for so long been something like microfiche. I have two examples here. These are both from the 1930s. On the right, it's an optograph. So that looks like one of those 15th century book wheels, but for film. And then on the left, there's just an envisioning of the reader of the future, which you've probably seen many of these. This is sort of like the future we thought we would get for so long. But after so long of something like microfiche being the dream, and everyone quotes Vannevar Bush, Memex, of course, is the microfiche vision. We finally made it, this thing that shrinks text so we can store loads of it, and then blows it back up again. And then it's pretty much obsolescent a few decades after every single library buys one. And I also want to say, first of all, there'll be people in the audience who are frowning at me right now. So you can have a technology that's obsolescent for one thing, but not another. Microfiche in film is brilliant for preservation. It's pretty lousy for access for most cases, for most use cases. But it's also been on my mind for a few other reasons recently, one of which will become very obvious soon in terms of a library vendor that has made the news lately. But I also think to the extent that microfiche is obsolescent for access, it points to an excellent way that we can interrogate our own blind spots when we imagine the future for our profession. And this is where I'm hoping the history will be most helpful. So, first story is technical obsolescence. And this is sort of about asking the question, how can we predict what we're working with now or what we think the probable future we're getting is, and sort of questioning our assumptions about where it's going. So, one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I bet you have too, is how and why we can find ourselves so enamored with deeply, deeply flawed new technologies and claim that they make information-related work easier and faster and better when objectively they might actually make it worse. And the conclusion that I've come to is sometimes we're sold a story of what the future is that's so persuasive we just believe it, despite evidence right in front of us. So this is a cover from a 1970s military study done by the US Army, which, by the way, the US military was deeply involved in almost all R&D development for information science, especially information retrieval in the 20th century, which explains a lot, which is a conversation for another day. But this study knocked me out when I came across it because it came a couple of decades into a long period of usability testing for microfilm. So industry, librarians, researchers were all looking at usability studies for microfilm, and they were getting a lot of user feedback about a lot of pain points around things that made it really, really hard to access. During this time, the user feedback's being captured. You could read all these reports. People are saying like, "Oh, it's really hard to find what I need. You know, that the quality of the film is quite poor. I can't zoom in properly." But then this study pops up, and it popped up for me because it led to a huge military investment in microfilm. So I was quite interested in it. The study is the Compact study from 1976, which stands for Computer Output Microfilm. And it was developed directly because of space limitations for military reports and the high cost of paper printing. So in 1976, printing to microfilm and storing it was a lot cheaper than to paper. As a direct outcome of the study, the Defense Technical Information Center in the Army went around to a bunch of military workers, office workers, and asked them to read a bunch of reports that they read every week or every month that landed on their desk in microfilm, and then report back on whether they found it easier to use, harder to use, faster to use than paper or not. I will read this. The outcome of the study is that users overwhelmingly said they found microfilm easier to use and just as fast or faster than the printed page, even though it literally was not, if you look at the data. And I want to read from the outcomes section a little bit that I've circled here. The overall paragraph describes how favorable the user's reaction was to reading these reports on microfilm. They're kind of funny. There's some good quotes. But I really like this bit. Users evidenced a remarkable degree of receptivity, appreciated the ease with which microfiche could be carried as opposed to hard copy reports, and sensed a, quote, status symbol with respect to having a new and modern piece of equipment. There are obviously some analogs that we can think of today. But I'm not here to just drag this experiment. There's a lot to learn from this about the structure of assumptions we make about the future and how we could have actually predicted obsolescence for microfiche from this study alone. These authors are actually pretty helpful because they lay out their assumptions. including paper costs will continue to increase, shortages will soar, the cost of storage will not decrease. Computer output microfiche is a more economical method of producing and handling reports. And my favorite one, the fifth one at the bottom, all systems design will continue to be predicated on a core limitation of 128 kilobytes. So there's their assumptions. You probably started thinking aloud when I was reading those assumptions how wrong they were. And actually, at this very same time, there are publications starting in the 50s and 60s about online search, full text retrieval, optical character recognition, graphical computer interfaces. I could go on. And all of this is happening, but everyone's assuming that digital storage and access and computer time itself is going to stay wildly expensive, so we don't really need to think about it or worry about it in an office environment. So by the mid-90s, computer time itself, all of these new technologies are cheaper and easier to use than paper. So we have the luxury in this room, looking back on microfiche, feeling very smug. And we can say, well, obviously they should have seen this coming. But my provocation is, what should we have asked these users instead of or in addition to what we did? So what we asked them was, did you like it? Was it cool and fun? Did it work faster? Was it better? I would say, first of all, we should have asked, what did you love about paper that you didn't get with microfilm, and how could that be kept? So paper and the page is, of course, still the metaphor that we use for access, usability, and interface. There's a reason that PDFs are so brilliant and researchers love them, because they look like the page, they keep everything that's good about the page, and they embed digital as the paradigm for information content and quality. And the other big question we should have asked is, what are the limitations with this technology? What's going to make it easy to walk away from this when the next thing comes? So for technical obsolescence, and I have one more kind of obsolescence, and then we'll jump into the future, which describes how a particular technology falls away from use or usefulness as a function of time. There were some warning signs. And we've got loads and loads of studies with these warning signs. Even without knowing a digital revolution was coming, we could have predicted a lot of this, the obsolescence due to limitations of the medium. So again, what are the flaws that mean that this technology, once there's a solution without these flaws, will immediately go away? We can extrapolate from this to ask, what do we assume will always run steady, stay the same, or not change because it's always been this way before? And maybe most important, we know our answers to these questions won't be right all the time, but they will be a lot more right than if we never ask them or think about it. So how can we build in time to be reflective and analytical and predictive about the technologies we use in our work so that we're making the best guesses about the future that will keep in circulation the values that we hold dear? So I want to emphasize and create some space around this last question by saying this kind of work will take time. Can't squeeze it in on your train rides to and from work. We need time built in for this. For radical sustainability to happen, we need this resource to first and foremost critically interrogate the normative power of the present, interrogate the hype cycles, and kind of think deeply. And so if we're going to be more than just reactive to the crises that are going to continue to come for us, one after another for the rest of our profession, we have to avoid just short-term thinking and avoid burnout by balancing time and space to do long-term and short-term work. My suggestion is we try to spend 10% of our time, just under 4 hours a week for all of us, being able to think about the long term. This can be 30 minutes a day, this can be an hour, whatever it is. And it can be as simple as a keep free on your calendar. So I sometimes put 45 minutes keep free on a Friday afternoon, and I sit and I think, what are the things I should be asking that I'm not? Even if I don't have 4 hours, if I have 45 minutes that week, that's massive. That's probably more valuable than the other 35 hours I'm spending that week. And you can just have a notebook. I got this from Brill de Gruyter outside. This could be your future notebook where you just write speculative things or really question what you're doing. Yeah, I'll stop there. So I have another story. This will be a little shorter and a little punchier. So there's another type of obsolescence that doesn't always have a name. I named it socio-technical obsolescence, which I will define soon. And I think it's just as important for us as we start to design the future. So I have another story. This is also about microfiche. Anyone familiar with University Microfilms International? This is a fun story. Well, it's very depressing and it's fun. So the story starts in 1938. A young Michigan entrepreneur named Eugene Power walks into the British Museum. He has a micro camera and he has a pitch. The pitch is, let me film your rare books for almost nothing, give you a safety preservation copy, and I will sell all the other extras back to the United States. So the museum says, yes, it's 1938, there are war clouds over Europe. This seems like a really good insurance model. What could go wrong? So the power deal looks very attractive. And to be fair to British Museum, loads and loads and loads of research libraries in the US and UK sign up for this. So the deal is the library would offer the stacks, a staff helper, and a token filming fee. Powers' team would pay the token fee and deliver one preservation negative to the library without distribution rights. He kept all the distribution rights and all the revenue from the positive copies that he sold, mostly to US libraries. I can see some faces, some collections people know where this is going. So librarians feel good. We preserve the books. We know microfilm is great at preservation, so we're doing great work already. So the British Library gig snowballs. More and more research libraries join the program. War breaks out. Everyone wants and needs cultural backup. And by the early 1940s, he's sending these 100-foot reels of film with early English books back and forth across the Atlantic. So now we fast forward to 1951. The Association of Research Libraries in the United States blesses University Microfilms as the publisher of record for every US PhD dissertation. So from then on, one copy of your thesis must pass through Ann Arbor, through UMI. UMI films it, sells it. You might get a royalty check. It might buy you a pizza. Libraries have effectively outsourced this entire genre to a private company. So then in 1962, Xerox, which is flush with copier money, which is another amazing library technology history story, is Xerox, buys UMI for about $8 million. Power stays on as executive, and the machine keeps going. Does anyone know what happens next? That's it. So then we jump to the late 1990s. Are you a tech person? So then we jump to the late 1990s. All those microfilm reels of early English books get scanned and repackaged as early English books online. Now lives behind a ProQuest paywall. The same libraries now pay for access to the very images they created 50 years earlier. And then Clarivate acquires ProQuest in May 2021 for $5.3 billion, combining cash and stock. The acquisition closes in December 2021 after a lot of concerns about antitrust from the FTC. So why does this matter for us? So I think this points to another type of obsolescence that we have to keep in mind, which is how are we designing ourselves to keep agency and power? There are obviously some immediate lessons, like always think one format shift ahead. Whatever we sign today, yes, I'm thinking about AI, you name it, rides on the same licensing agreements we lock in now. But returning to our definition of obsolescence, one thing we need to do is make sure we're designing so our core values are ready to hop onto the next platform. To do that, we need a mental model for socio-technical obsolescence as well. This is a term I made up. I'm sure there's a better one, but I'm talking about sociology of the possible after this, so I thought it sort of worked. So it describes how technology can lose its function for us because the power, funding, and responsibility structures around it shift so far that it doesn't serve us anymore. So we see this over and over in academic libraries. The gadget doesn't wear out. The film still works. It holds images just fine, but the whole access process has changed and lost a lot of practical usefulness for us due to kind of these things that we didn't consider about what would happen when hands changed. And I think that this is a really important thing to think alongside with just the technical obsolescence. So I do think we've gotten a lot better at seeing this coming. And I've added some questions that we can ask ourselves as we think about designing with obsolescence towards the future that we want. I'm just checking that we're okay for time. I think we're all right for time, aren't we? Yeah, do you still want to end right at 11? Okay, all right, so we'll put all this together. You'll get these slides later, but really the questions here that you can see are sort of what are the beliefs that have to stay true for the systems to work? Who holds the system, who holds the decision-making power around the system or service? Who benefits first? Who benefits last? And how are the burdens and benefits of the model and technology being distributed? And that is kind of broadly defined. And then, of course, is the system set up to reproduce inequalities or create new ones? This is the kind of like Friday afternoon with your future notebook work that I think is so critical. So doing all this together, if we want to do radical sustainability work on our institutions, we need to balance not just our current and future users, and that's without even thinking about the rest of the planet and the planet itself. We need to be taking real time to reflect on every type of obsolescence on the horizon that's coming for us, and that we may be right now, wittingly or unwittingly, or all too aware that we are co-creating. We will likely need to challenge the norms and at times our individual institutions' work, which is another thing we need from them. I think we need our institutions to be open and willing to balance long-term and short-term thinking. In my experience, leadership is, and they really appreciate this kind of thought. And we need to avoid bad long-termism, which I'm giving its own slide, mostly because I hail most recently from San Francisco, where there is effective altruism, something that people talk about. Okay, so it's made its way here. This is the idea that we should spend our time doing the most good for the biggest number of people. So like utilitarianism, basically reconceived. But what it's meant is a bunch of people have flown to the Bay Area to work on what they imagine AI safety crises of the future will be, which they see as more important than the actual suffering of people in the present. And they're pretty open about that. And that's the trap that we can fall into if we do this purely from like a greatest good for the greatest number of people. No, we need to start with our values. If we're values driven for ourselves, our institution, our profession, we can avoid this like kind of wacky spun out abstraction that I think results in pretty bad decision making. So you're probably ready for me to start speaking in concrete terms, like what does this actually mean in practice? These are for me, and I want to hear about yours. So without further ado, don't enjoy criticizing these too much because I will challenge you to make your own. Here are my concrete ideas about radical sustainability based on my highest values in my institution. So my highest values are universal access to knowledge and preservation of the things that matter, not everything. And balance with where my institution is going, what they care about. Rachel's talked about how ambitious ManMat is and the way that it operates. Some proposals that I would have would include certainly collective work for infrastructure and content, whatever that means. And I think that is absolutely in line with all three sets of values. I would focus on redundancy. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. To move this work into the long term, thinking hundreds or even thousands of years out, this means things being on the cloud and backup locations. Mutual aid networks set up to create resilience. We know future crises will keep coming, even to places that now feel quite stable and have historically been quite stable. There will be a crisis. We will need to rely on networks that we've set up and kind of mutual aid networks that right now we might not be benefiting from. I'd like to see the institutions I work at think about their most critical outputs as well as their core collections, the things that are so foundational that you could rebuild the university research culture from them. And focus on those, prioritize that content. Try to do everything we can to avoid technical and social technical obsolescence around them. And if we're not able to do that, we're already in social technical obsolescence. So these first two boxes are all about collectivity and individual institutions bringing unique strength. This requires ongoing iterative analysis about value, identity, uniqueness. And there are a lot of really amazing projects already happening in this space. You're probably involved in some. For example, MMU is currently one of the pilot partners for the UK Print Book Collective. I love this experiment. The UK Print Book Collective is pooling analysis of all print collections in the country to guarantee at least 7 unique copies of print books in the UK. I think that's brilliant. Again, this requires thinking within our institutions to identify unique value and collectively outwards. Financial sustainability is obviously a major, major crisis in the moment, as Rachel's alluded to. And in this area, we can also consider how financial allocations can support not just survival during times of trade-off and difficulty, but reinvestment of seed funds to build the futures we envision. An example that we're already seeing is collections budgets being used to create OER. This is balancing short-term, medium-term, long-term thinking. It's brilliant, and it's designing ourselves out of socio-technical obsolescence. And I put this slide in because I sent these slides to a friend and she said, delete that slide. She was like, I sent this to Lisa Schiff. She's a brilliant librarian at the California Digital Library. She said, oh, open access could be good, but it could be bad. It doesn't definitionally do all the things that you're saying here that it does. There are major questions for her around commodification. So openness alone doesn't kind of guarantee equity or inclusion. And I put this in there because this is exactly the kinds of critical friend conversations that I think we can be having with one another. Is we can say, here's where I think we should be investing long term. Here's where I think things should be going. And a critical friend saying, oh, you're making a lot of assumptions. But yeah, open access is my passion. And I genuinely believe that all the work that I do for the rest of my career will be around this. And that doesn't seem to have text on it. I promise it was really inspiring. All right, we'll move on. So just to say we can begin anywhere with this framework, every decision that we make working from this kind of perspective ensures that we're designing in a long-term future that will make our daily work more rigorous, more focused, and more impactful. So I've given some concrete examples. I've sped through them because I think probably they'll have linked up to things you've heard before, and I want to hear really from you. But now I just want to make this yours. So I want to return to the definition I proposed of what radical sustainability is, which is a practice of choosing priorities in a very focused way to stretch our values across time, space, and obsolescence, keeping the things and ideas we value in productive circulation for as long as humans on the planet can do so, designing with obsolescence in mind in order to build the very long-term futures that we want. So how do we do this? I want to end by actually all of us practicing imagining the futures that we want. And this step of imagination is really, really critical. As Rachel said, librarians are resilient, optimistic, and creative. And I cannot wait to hear what you've come up with today. But I've got a couple of thought exercises. They're inspired by this book, which I could not recommend more highly, by a sociologist in the US called Dr. Ruth Benjamin. And this book is really, really excellent because it reminds us how important the step of imagining the future that we want is. She reminds us that specificity is essential. We can't just say we want a better world. By being very specific, I put this quote here, about the things we can imagine in the future, we sharpen our powers of discernment about what we want and do not want, identifying the dynamics that are sustaining. Second, she reminds us that imagination is also embedded in more mundane things like grades, money, laws. If we don't imagine how they could be different, we'll see them not just as natural, but immutable. Third, she reminds us that imagination is a critical political strength. Any deterioration of our ability to imagine, any technology that deteriorates our ability to imagine, is going to be extremely deleterious to our ability to act politically. And finally, in her words, lest we forget, designing cruel oppressive structures requires imagination too. So I set time for 2 exercises. We probably will just have time for 1. So I think, but let's see. So these are both totally optional. People are coming in very different places today based on what you need, who you are, how you process, what you're bringing with you. So I want to take, say, 5 minutes, and this can either be solo, small group activity. You can write, draw, or just sit there. You will get the slides later. But I want to think about preferable, possible, probable futures, because I think it's kind of how we jump off. So there are many futures at any given moment for any given subject in the universe. Physics tells us this. And it helps for me to start thinking about what I imagine is probable versus possible right now, because we tend to assume that what we see as the most probable future is the one that will be inevitable. Sometimes we speak about it as though it's already happened, as though perhaps we've already lost, based, of course, on our assumptions at the time, and remembering our lessons from microfilm about how wrong we can be. Probable futures take our current business as usual trends and assume they'll continue drawing a straight line forward. So, for example, one probable future in scholarly publishing is continued conglomeration of commercial publishing services and companies. But there are also possible, plausible, could happen futures, highly speculative, might possibly happen. All of these are possible. All of these bear thinking about. And our goal is not to limit ourselves to the normative power of what we currently assume is possible. So what I'd like you to do for the next 5 minutes, and I was sort of thinking 3 minutes on your own, 2 minutes with a friend, but I think it should be pretty open to kind of who you are, how you process what you want to do, is think about first, one factor, problem, or major issue related to your current library work. Something where there is a probable future, or at least one you see now that you don't necessarily want. What would that be? And then the harder bit is, what would the preferable future be? What would the alternative be? And the hardest bit, what are some specific things your institution could decide to do today? And that's at your level, your library's level, kind of leadership level, to make a preferable future more likely. And the answer might just involve stopping and thinking. So I'm going to stop. And again, like, this is however you want to use the time. If you want to jot down notes or draw, take time to reflect. If you need to just space out. And after a couple of minutes, if you want to turn and talk to someone else and have a chat, I think that's great. And if you don't, that's great too. And then we'll come back together. And then I think I'll wrap up pretty quickly, and then we could do some Q&A and hear what you came up with. Does that sound okay? All right. Hopefully that's accessible enough to read, but I'll reread the question. What are the probable versus preferable futures for any aspect of your current library work at your institution? What are 3 specific things, well, it doesn't have to be 3, your institution could decide to do to make the preferable future more likely? And we'll come back. All right. Thank you for being willing and open. I appreciate it. I've got a second exercise. We're at 10:53. So what I might do is I'll introduce the exercise. We can decide if we want to spend time doing that or if we'd rather just chat. And I'll send the slides after anyway. So this is kind of thinking about the long-term future with a couple of deep points about thinking about how we can design things into obsolescence if we try. So I wanted to think about what it might look like to walk into your library in 100 years in this dream future that you have. I'm particularly interested in any structural barriers that you would have designed out of existence at that point. You don't have to decide how it would happen, but what's a structural barrier of any kind that will have gone away in your future vision? What would a short interaction with someone using your library look like? What do they need? How is their need solved? And what sort of technical and socio-technical apparatuses, stuff, whatever it is obsolescent that's current today? With the idea that we can make things obsolescent, we can design our future with this as an outcome. So I'll do a quick show of hands. Would you rather spend the last 5 minutes chatting through this, or do you want to come back together as a larger group and kind of share back or ask questions or reflect? Who would like to do this? Who would like to kind of do a larger groupy thing? Okay, I think larger groupy thing. So anyhow, I'll share these slides. You'll get them later, and you can do with them what you will. This is my favorite technology. Thank you so much for your time and your brilliance. Thank you so much to the organizers who did all the invisible labor to make this happen today. This kind of work is exactly what we should be making time for. And I'm just very excited for everyone's excellent conference day ahead. So again, thank you for your willingness and openness and for showing up. And my email's there. I'd love to hear feedback if you have questions or clarification or challenges or anything.